Hi there. My name is Alec Nevala-Lee, and I was a Hugo Award finalist for the group biography Astounding. John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction. In the course of researching that book, I got to know the science fiction writer Barry Malzberg, who has had one of the most singular careers in all of science fiction, with many books and stories to his name, including the classic novel Beyond Apollo and the essay collection The Bend at the End of the Road. In July of 2019, over the course of 3 sessions, I spoke to Barry about his life and work, and we covered a lot of very interesting material about his career and the history of science fiction as a whole. So here it is. Enjoy. So I'm going to start out with a nod to what the fan Peter Graham famously said about how the real golden age of science fiction is 12.
That's disputed. Terry Carr might have been the first to say it. A lot of people might have said it.
Yes, I agree. I think the sentiment though is very interesting, right? Which
yes,
is that
indeed.
The works that we kind of stumble across and absorb when we're in our early teens are the ones that tend to stick with us the most.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk just a bit about some of the works and authors that you encountered around that time that made an impression on you.
Besser, Sheckley, Kornbluth, Pohl, the usual roster within the field. I like Galaxy a lot more than Astounding, although Walter Miller was astonishing and astounding. But great work in Astounding was to me anomalous or aberrant. In Galaxy, it was consistent.
So were you primarily reading
there were no
stories?
Shocking choices among my recollection. I knew who was good early. Kuttner, certainly.
So were these stories that you mostly were reading, were these stories that you were mostly reading as they came out, like in the magazine?
Yes, exactly. And then I go back. I fell into it at 12, and of course there's back reading, and I picked that up pretty quickly. The previous decade, anyway, the major anthologies, all of that. And I was impressed by what should impress me, and unimpressed by what shouldn't, as what Astounding was becoming at that time. But there was still enough good work in Astounding to make generalization very difficult. I was not surprisingly much of a fantasy and science fiction magazine of F&SF reader, although in due course that became my major market, if not the market with which I was most associated. But I wasn't reading it at the time. I should have.
So just for some context, can you tell me what date we're talking about here? What period this would have been?
50s. The first magazine I ever purchased new from the newsstand was the March '52 Galaxy. I was 12 3/4 years, and that I had been reading science fiction for about a year before that, but this was the first time I initiated, as it were, a contact. A close friend was a crazed science fiction fan and was pushing this on me a few years earlier, and I was reading Astounding. I was following it. In fact, my aunt bought me a subscription for my 12th birthday. And the first issue I received was August '51. I wish I could tell you the title story, but I can't. Walter Miller was in it. So I was reading Astounding and came to Galaxy about 7 months later, and Galaxy was exactly what I wanted at that time.
So what were some of the stories that really stand out?
That issue had The Year of the Jackpot by Heinlein and the last installment of The Demolished Man. Wow. And Catch That Martian by Jerry Soule and something by Damon Knight. And I was astonished at how good I thought The Year of the Jackpot was absolutely remarkable. And I can say that, 65 years later, it's still remarkable. What a visionary story. Do you know it?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's the sunspot story. But he caught the restlessness and the poison, prescient madness of the McCarthy Cold War decade brilliantly. I felt nothing I had ever read anywhere seemed to capture what I was noticing better than that story. And Demolished Man, I started with the third installment, and of course got to the back issues, was simply astonishing. And what's remarkable is that 65 years, more than that later, I still have a very, very high opinion of both.
Were you involved with the fan community at that point?
Not at all. Not in the least. At Stevens Book Service, which I memorialized in my novel Dwellers of the Deep, Romana Clay of fandom in the 50s, I hung around Stevens Book Service and talked to a few people there. And as I said, I had a close friend who was reading this stuff furiously, but I had no fan activity, none whatsoever. I knew fandom existed. In my casual chats at Stevens Book Service, I talked to quite a few people who were involved in it, and I knew what it was, and I wanted no part of it. It just did not interest me. My first contacts with fandom were in the early 70s.
So at what point did you start to think about writing for yourself?
Immediately. I had received a rejection slip from Amazing Stories in the 7th grade, either the 6th or 7th grade. I was writing it before I found that March 52 Galaxy. I wanted to write it. Everybody does initially. And there were a few feeble attempts. And then, and I can mark it, the point of breakage was Look Homeward, Angel by Thomas Wolfe, which I read at 15. And I didn't want to be Alfred Bester or Heinlein anymore. I wanted to be Thomas Wolfe. And I fell into the mainstream literature and read avidly. And Wolfe represented the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of life I wanted to have, which is a commentary of what I was like at 15. You wouldn't have wanted to have known me. I never abandoned science fiction reading. I sporadically read the magazines all the way through, right up to certainly to the early 60s, and collected them. But I never thought of myself as ambitious as a would-be science fiction writer after the age of 12. It was something I read and in exceptional cases admired, but I didn't want to write it. I wanted to be a major American mainstream, hate the term, writer. And as I have written, and I've written of this copiously, Alec, and surely you've read it, I fell into science fiction as a writer. It was a default because I felt I had nowhere else to go, and I began writing it very seriously at 26 because I felt that it was my last chance for publication. And at that point, my previous experience was quite valuable. I had a good reading background in the field. I knew what it was. I was not I was a literary writer trying to find, having failed as a literary writer, trying to find a market. That's absolutely correct. But I knew this market. I had a feel for it from the beginning. And it was just a question of learning how to do it technically, because I knew what it was. there have been, as you know, many literary writers who defaulted into it, or who in later career, like Bartholomew or Updike, tried to write it, but they did not have that instinctive subterranean grasp of the field which early reading provides. And their efforts were always clumsy, negligible, or worse. This was not a problem I had. I knew what science fiction was. I had to learn. I had to learn a certain narrative attack or technique, but I knew the difference between a science fiction story and a literary story, which could be taken for science fiction. And once I mastered technique, I was reasonably successful.
So who were some of the literary authors who influenced you before you turned to science fiction?
I could say all of them. Nabokov, Mailer, Updike, James A.G. is a magnificent essayist, and of course, let us now praise Famous Men, which was the most important book in terms of my development as a writer. Was the book most important to me. Well, but all of them rattle off a list of major or even minor American literary writers, and they had an influence. I was influenced by everything I read, and I synthesized it, tried to synthesize it. Salinger was an enormous influence. After I outgrew Thomas Wolfe, which anybody sensible does at 17 at the latest, I wanted to be Mailer. Still do, but it's not going to happen.
So what were...
If it was going to happen, it would have happened 40 years ago. But you can see Mailer's influence in Bend at the End of the Road, the essays. The voice of the essays. It doesn't read like Mailer. It shouldn't. But I think it has that level of intricacy and ambition and scope.
Yeah, no, he was a huge influence on me growing up. And I think about him almost every day, for better or worse.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of young men of any era look at someone like Mailer and say, that's the kind of career I want to have, right? Where you have a big bestseller at age 25 and you write novels and you write nonfiction and you're a journalist and you kind of make your mark as a public figure.
Well, I would say this. I wanted to write like Mailer. What he was doing was exactly what I wanted to do, but I wanted a career like Roth. Roth was the specter and a taunt. And I can tell you about my good friend Arlene Heyman, now a psychoanalyst and a novelist, publishing her first novel at 77, which is remarkable. First time I met her, I was 25, she was 24. I met her in the basement of the Hall of Languages, where she was a creative writing graduate fellow, and I was the Schubert Foundation fellow taking a few courses in creative writing. And my first words to her when she introduced herself, I said, when Roth was 25, he had the National Book Award. I'm 25 and I'm sitting in the basement of a rotting building of a second or third rate university. The outlook, I said, is not terrific. Now how I could introduce myself to her in that way and have had her affection and esteem or tolerance for half a century, I don't know. Because those were the first words I spoke to her. But that is exactly how I felt. And Roth remained a taunt for right up to this moment. I wanted his career. Mailer's career, no. Mailer had a really screwed up personal life, as we know, and almost killed his wife, and almost went to jail, and probably should have. And was a buffoon and a public idiot. Great writer as he was. Roth did all the right things. He wrote and he wrote. He was dedicated. He was quiet. He was businesslike. He did what he had to do, and he more or less stayed to the side, and he got everything except the Nobel Prize. That's who I wanted to be.
Yeah, for me, it's someone like Updike, who also had a kind of a messy private life, but was also just very productive. He kind of just turned out these books on an annual basis, and essays and poems and short stories, and it seemed almost inhuman. But again, these are the outliers, right? These are the exceptions. It's very hard to have that career, right?
Yes, it is.
And
the New Yorker helped a lot. They loved him.
Yeah.
He was cosseted and protected by the New Yorker all his life, all his creative life.
In your case, you were better off switching to science fiction.
Yes, I was not better off. I had to. I mean, it was not a question of agonizing. Should I be this? Should I be that? Science fiction for me was last chance gulch. It was that or nothing, because I tried. I sure as hell couldn't write westerns or gothics, and I can prove it from the abortive attempts I made. I could write mystery short stories, and I sold a few. And in later life, I got with the help of Pronzini and many guys, I got rather good at it in an eccentric way, but it was never my field. And certainly at the beginning, I wrote clumsy mystery short stories, a few of which sold to the bottom markets. But I could write science fiction. Of all the genres, it was the one for which I had a flair, the only one.
Can you tell me?
It was a forced choice. It was the only place I had to go.
So what were some of your first sales?
First sale was to Wildcat magazine, the softest is softcore pornography, a story called The Bed, published in the 366 issue of Wildcat magazine, a fifth or seventh rate Playboy imitator. My second sale was to that same magazine under a different pseudonym exactly a year later. And my third sale, which was the sale that mattered, was to Galaxy Science Fiction, a short story sold on January 11th, 1967. And as I wrote George P. Eliot, my mentor at Syracuse at that time, finally, I've sold a magazine of which anyone has heard. And that was the first significant sale.
So when you were writing science fiction at that point, were there particular writers you were trying to emulate or models that you had in mind?
Silverberg, Bester, Kornbluth, Miller, the usual suspects.
Were you, did you associate with other writers at that point?
Well, I was working at the Scott Meredith Agency, so writers came in and out, and I had glancing acquaintance with some writers, and there was my friend Arlene from Syracuse, and there was George P. Eliot, my mentor there, with whom I remained in pretty close touch. But I wasn't really socializing with writers at that point. As I became active in science fiction, and then began to I never was a convention goer, but even as a non-convention goer, I must have gone to 20 or 30 in the first 5 years when I became involved, and so I socialized. I got to know a lot of people.
I think there are going to be some people.
I said Roth, but when I got into science fiction, Silverberg became for me in science fiction what Roth had been in the mainstream. Silverberg was the writer I wanted to be, the career I wanted, the stature, the ambition of style. I wanted to do what he was doing. I made the crucial mistake of thinking that if he got away with this, I could get away with it, which was true, but only up to a certain point, and then it wasn't.
Well, I spoke earlier about the outliers, right? And I think that's another example of an outlier who can kind of seduce young men and young writers into trying to do the same thing.
Yeah. Although they all warned me, Silverberg notably, that this was not the place. Science fiction in the late 60s, early 70s gave an illusion of opening, the so-called new wave, and all of that. So there was an illusion that one could do ambitious literary science fiction to the limit of one's ability and have a career, or at least a lot of sales. And that was true to a point until the sales figures began to come in. And it became starkly clear to publishers that it was not going to sell, and from a commercial standpoint, it was a dead end to be a literarily ambitious science fiction writer. But by that time, people like Dish and Silverberg, and I could rattle off, we were too deep in to really get out. So a lot of things changed, and then Star Wars. Star Trek was the forerunner, and Star Wars in 1976 just blew out everything in terms of literary ambition and stretching the borders of the field and all of that. As the way to go as a kind of default, it wasn't working. Star Wars validated or made heroic and enormously commercial the science fiction of the 30s, the pre-Campbellian science fiction, if you will, and everything suddenly was over in terms of expanding the field, changing the field in a more literary way. Again, that's a generality, and there were a good many writers who continued. There was a lot of good work. In fact, there was a lot of great work, but it was against the grain, and it didn't sell. Not like Star Wars, anyway.
I actually want to go back for a minute, because you mentioned Scott Meredith. And I think there are going to be a lot of people listening to this who actually don't know who Scott Meredith was. And I think this is actually like a really interesting period in his career. So could you talk a little bit about Scott Meredith and his agency?
Well, I wrote at length about Scott and his agency. And I think I can take a pass on that by saying that in the so-called special issue of fantasy and science fiction for June 2003, the Malzberg special issue, I contributed a 10,000-word essay, Tripping with the Alchemist, which is all about my experience at Scott Meredith and Scott's history as an agent and the agency's history, and the whole story gets told. It's reprinted. The essay is reprinted in my essay collection, Breakfast in the Ruins, and it was also in Nebula Awards 2005, published by NAL, so it's been around. And I tell the whole story there, all of it. How I got into it, what it was like, what we did, how Scott's agency, in effect, was a paradigm of the corruption of the publishing industry from 1946, which is when the doors were open, to his death on February 11th, 93. And to understand Scott and his agency is to understand, in some microcosm, exactly what happened to the market and to so-called literature publishing in this country in those 47 years. And off and on of those four. I came to the agency in June of 65. I was in and out of it for the next 6 years. Then I was out of it, writing full-time from 71 to 81. Then I came back to the agency in 81, and was there all through the last years, his demise, the sale of the agency to others, to another interest, and its slow and then rapid fragmenting. And so I saw it all, and all of it is in that aforementioned essay, to the best of my ability. And it's a relief. It's a relief to say that it's there, it exists. It's not hard to find, and anybody who's interested can find it easily available in the two books which are advertised online. They're both in Kindle, so it's there. I would sum up the Scott Meredith experience in the words of Norman Spinrad. You know Spinrad, major science fiction writer with an interesting, mottled, if you will, career. But Spinrad said to me, and I quoted him in the essay, he said, I owe Scott, in a sense, I owe Scott everything. He worked there from 62 to 64. And he said, Scott taught me everything about publishing. He taught me what a shit pile it was, and I never had to be disillusioned after that. I learned early. He was out of the agency at 24, knowing everything he had to know about publishing and the reality of science fiction and so much else. I guess I feel the same. It's irreplaceable education.
So, were you working there when you published your first novel?
No, I was out of the agency. That was the first time Scott fired me. I was heroin to Scott. You know, he knew I was dangerous and I didn't fit, but I made money for him. He couldn't resist it. But the first time he fired me was in 1166. This is correct. I came back. I did come back in 67, and yes, I was working full-time for Scott. I'm correcting myself now. I was in Scott's full-time employee when I wrote my first novel, which was a softcore novel, softcore pornography for Beacon Books. I wrote that in April of 67, and it was published in December of that year. It's a very bad novel, which was slaughtered. What little was left of it was slaughtered by the editor, who edited it out of all recognition. But it was published, and that was my first novel, and I wrote it while I was at Scott. And then there were then a heap of novels to Midwood Books. Again, they were marketed and sold as softcore pornography, but unlike the book for Beacon, they were literally ambitious. I was writing to the limit of my ability, and some of those books were quite good. I was not in Scott's employ at that time. And so
I want to ask you about that, actually. So I've heard that the softcore market around this time, mid-'60s, was actually a good place where you could get away with stuff that you couldn't get away with in terms of experimentation and just kind of writing in unusual forms, and as long as you respected the conventions, right? Category.
This was not my term, but there was a very funny article. It might even have been in the Times. Some softcore writers talked about the tweenies. They were called the tweenies at Midwood and Beacon and elsewhere. The tweenies were the stuff that was between the sex scenes. And to keep the FBI and the Supreme Court at bay, it was felt that you had to have tweenies in a ratio of about 2 to 1. That is, 2 tweenies and 1 sex scene. And the tweenies write any goddamn thing you want. Anything. You want to plagiarize Mailer? I didn't do it, but I found the word-for-word plagiarism of Mailer in a Midwood textbook where I was browsing. Nobody read it and nobody cared. You could do anything as long as you obeyed the rough perimeters of the form. And for the soft core market, you worked the euphemisms, not the actual terms. But it was a great learning experience for all of us. Silverberg has been very open about his career. He wrote an inordinate number of books for the California House, and it paid very well. And he learned to write novels by writing novels. To a degree, me too.
I mean, I know for a fact that a lot of other writers, like Lawrence Block, Donald Westlake, Dean Koontz.
Block had Westlake and Silverberg, and which was a big secret at the time. Now, Everett Hunter. Everett Hunter, at the top of his career, was writing for Cozy Books in California. This was Everett Hunter after The Blackboard Jungle and Strangers When We Meet, and the film scripts for The Birds and Marnie, was writing books for $1,200, $1,500 for the California houses. Why, you ask? Because it was money he could come in and Scott would give it to him in cash. It was money for which he never had to account. And Hunter had, shall we say, domestic or familial reasons for not wanting that income or expenditure to be known. That was his dissipation money. So many people. John Jakes was writing. People whose names would surprise you. Westlake, as I said, was writing and franchising out porn novels for friends and acquaintances to write under his pseudonym. It was a cash cow until suddenly in 1965 it wasn't, and that market collapsed for all kinds of reasons. And that too, I wrote about that. Tripping with the Alchemist has it all.
Can I ask how you got involved in writing your first novel for that category?
My agent, I wanted an agent other than Scott Meredith. My agent, James Seligman, had a relationship. I mean, I had sold books to Beacon Books and knew the editor. And he said, "Do you want to try this?" So I wrote a portion and outline, and he sent it to the editor, who happened to be old Jake Jacobson, who later became editor of Galaxy. Quite a character, Jake was. And Jake took it, and the advance was $750, and I wrote it. And Jake then, as I said, Jake interfered with it in every paragraph, and then added a little epilogue which destroyed any point that that feeble novel might have had, and that was my introduction to publishing. But it didn't bother me. As Silverberg, as Spinrad said, I had no reason to be disillusioned. Therefore, I wasn't. I knew what the market was, and I knew what they do to you. So that's how I got involved. And then my colleague at Scott Meredith, Bob Devaney, was hired by Midwood Belmont Tower. He became a porn editor there, and Devaney opened the door, and in late '67, and I went through. I did a dozen novels for him in, 8-9 months maybe, some of which were quite good. None of which have ever been noticed, nor should they be.
I'm curious, when you have to write, can I ask, if you have to write, that many novels in that time span, what's your process like?
I wrote them. I was always fluid. I was fluid, and I was fluid from the very beginning. I just wrote them. And as I've said, and I've been very public about this, the only reason I survived in this business from the beginning, let alone through the whole arc of my so-called major career in the 70s. It took me a while, and I had to struggle, but I was able to publish my first draft. And that work, for which I am known and noted and may or may not be remembered, are first drafts. Beyond Apollo is a first draft. Underlay, my best novel, is a first draft. I didn't fall out of bed or an apple tree being able to do this, but I was able to do it. And that's what I did. And how did I write them? I wrote them. And as Retke's famous poem goes, I learned by going where I had to go.
So throughout this period, were you also writing a lot of short science fiction?
Yes, I was, because I was smart enough. Dumb as I was overall, I had little flickers of intelligence, and one was the porn market was about as secure as the Brooklyn Dodgers' tenure in Brooklyn was in 1956, i.e. it could go any day and it would. And I knew that, and I wrote science fiction short stories. I wrote novelettes. I wrote a novel, The Empty People, which was published by Lancer. I wrote ace doubles, books which became ace doubles. I knew it was going to go. And indeed, by early 71, it was gone. People who did not see this coming got into a lot of trouble. But I knew that how tentative it was, and that was never an issue. So I kept on with science fiction, made it clear that I knew that was where I was going to have to go and then have to stay. And that worked out okay.
At this point, were you spending time or interacting with other writers?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
Who were some of the writers that you knew best?
The writers I knew best. Dean Koontz, early in his career, who was an agency client. We were Pronzini, of course, with whom we wrote 5 novels together. Silverberg, of course. A lot of people, varying degrees of acquaintances. Koontz and I, Pronzini and I, knew each other very, very well. These were very close friendships. Silverberg was miles ahead of me as a writer, but in Michael Swanwick's words about his own relationship with Silverberg, from the beginning, Silverberg treated me like a human being. And we embarked upon, in the early to mid-70s, upon a correspondence which lasted 20 years and is extraordinary.
I wonder if you could talk a bit about Dean Koontz, because I don't think a lot of people realize that he had such a prolific career in science fiction and mystery and other genres before he really broke through with the novels for which he's best known.
Yes, he did. And I was there to see all of it. He wanted to be a science fiction writer, and in his own words, in the early to mid 70s, and he had published by that time several novels. He said, "I just realized, it wasn't what I wanted it to be, or where I could go. So I had to go elsewhere. I want to interject that Demon Seed is splendid. That it became a movie, as you may know. It was adapted for a big deal movie. But it was a novel, and that and the other Bantam novel, Flesh in the Furnace, were written when he had essentially given up. He had closed the doors, and through mystery and suspense, was working his way out of it. But he was a very good science fiction writer, better than he thought himself to be, and could have had a major career. And we know what happens to people who like Phil Dick, who had major careers in science fiction. So he was smart. Good writer.
One of the first books I ever read about writing was a book called Writing Popular Fiction, which
I remember
Koontz
that.
wrote. He wrote probably when he was in his late 20s.
Yes.
and I still have
he
a
also
copy of it.
wrote, also, I think, for Writer's Digest Press, How to Write a Bestseller, which I found amusing because at the time the book was published, he had not written a bestseller. He did, as we know.
Yeah, that first book, though, is one that I basically memorized. I read it a lot growing up, and I still think about some of the rules that he lays down for writing science fiction in particular.
Yeah. He was quite sensible. I agree with Vonnegut that writing cannot be taught. It can be learned, but it cannot be taught. But stipulating that, Koontz's books were as good as any, no question.
So right now we've gotten to maybe like the late 60s. I think I'm going to save the Campbell story for next time.
Okay.
But I was wondering if you could maybe set the stage and maybe talk a little bit about where you were professionally at that point, leading up to that.
At the point I met Campbell, which was on June 18th, 1969, I was editor of the SFWA Bulletin. I had sold the Empty People to Hoskins. I had sold about a dozen, maybe 20 science fiction stories. I had been on a Nebula final ballot. I was at the beginning of what could have been any kind of a career at that time. I was established as an unestablished writer of promise, and was beginning. I was on the cusp of my most prolific period. I was SFWA Bulletin editor, and taking that volunteer job was essentially for me an excuse to meet Campbell. Dear Mr. Campbell, as you may have read, I've become editor, and on behalf of the membership, I would like to interview you. Bullshit. On behalf of me, I would like to meet you. So I met him, and I was in his office on June 18, 1969. A couple of 32 days before the moon landing, and Jesus, 50 years, just 50 years and a month before now, and we talked for an hour and a half. I was initially awed, and eventually disgusted.
So I was thinking that maybe we could start today with the story of how you became involved with the magazine Amazing Stories.
As I wrote you yesterday, again, I have written about that fairly extensively. However, very quickly, Harry Harrison, very, very early in my so-called career, and early in my tenure at Meredith, I intersected with Harry Harrison, who was then editing Amazing, met briefly. For reasons I could never deduce, Harrison decided that he liked me, and all through the early years was a great support and comfort in many ways. He wanted desperately to get out of the editing job as quickly as he could. The pay was abominable. The magazine was abominable. The publisher, at least in any business terms, was abominable. He asked me if I wanted to do it. In fact, he begged me to want to do it, and then politicized with Saul Cohn, the publisher, to have me succeed him, which I did for 6 months between April and October of 1968.
Well, can you back up for a second and remind me what the situation was with Amazing Stories at that point?
The situation, Amazing had been, Ziff Davis had been a major publisher, huge chain publisher in those days, had wanted to get rid of Amazing for a long time. The circulation was small, it was not improving, and they weren't interested in science fiction. They'd been trying to dump it for a long time. And they eventually, Saul Cohn, who had been an employee at Avon for many years and had come into some money, which is a subsidiary story, Saul Cohn expressed interest in becoming publisher of Amazing because Saul Cohn, had come in and saved Galaxy 4 years later when Galaxy magazine was about to run out of money. And Saul became publisher and put in a little money and help the magazine stagger along through a critical period. When Galaxy had solved its problems, Saul, who was always temporary, went away, but he decided he liked science fiction, or at least the idea of editing a potentially profitable magazine. So he took the that scrap from Ziff Davis. And then he needed an editor who was Joseph Ross for a while, then Harry Harrison. Saul, now we're getting into intricacies and detail which are interesting but have absolutely nothing to do with my so-called career. However, the newly formed SFWA and Saul Cohn were immediately at odds because Saul was legally exercising a standard contract which Amazing had made with every story ever sold them, which was the right to reprint indefinitely, unlimited use, reprinting without further payment. And Saul was availing himself of this by creating 5 or 10 subsidiary magazines, great stories from SF, titles like that, and was putting in without payment to the authors, reprinting stories from back issues of Amazing, which at that time there were 40 years of them, and not paying the writers. The Science Fiction Writers of America, newly formed, and looking to make some noise and draw some attention, decided to make Saul a test case and demanded that he pay for reuse of the material. Saul said, I have a perfect legal right to reprint these without fee, and the SFWA declared a boycott. That if Saul insisted upon that position, they would ask all members to cease to contribute to Amazing. The magazines at that time were about 2/3 reprint and 1/3 new material. But Saul could have lumbered along for a while. However, he felt that to have the SFWA openly making him an enemy might attack his very circulation base and his distributors. So, as it were, he sued for peace. He agreed that he would pay a minimal cent a word for reprint use, and the SFWA would abolish the boycott. As another condition of this, Harry Harrison, vice president of the very early SFWA, would be the editor of Amazing Stories, in effect giving the SFWA a beachhead into the magazine so that they could observe Saul and restrain him from illegal use. Harry became editor, buying 3-4 stories a month, and otherwise being a witness to the reprints. He was very unhappy. The magazine had a bad reputation. Harry Harrison, had a very good reputation and was at an early peak in his career and didn't have the time or the interest. And he just wanted to get out. But in order to get out in an amicable way, he needed to present Saul with someone who could succeed at him, because Saul's knowledge of science fiction, let alone its personalities, was nil. So Harry pushed me upon Saul as his successor, and Saul agreed. And that is how, for 6 months, I became the editor of Amazing Stories.
So at that point, you were presumably aware of
completely. I was absolutely aware. I was aware, and contempt for Amazing had seeped into every level of my cognition. But on the other hand, the SFWA at that point was approving, and I found it interesting. It was an interesting place for a 28-year-old trying to start a career to be, dreadful as the magazine and its conditions were. And I took it. I took it for 6 months, and early on, I began to fight with Saul. I want the reprints to be eliminated. I wanted 100% of the contents to be all new material. Saul resisted. because this would cost and there would be acquisitions problem, and he protested. We never settled that. All through my tenure, it was 1/3 new, 2/3 reprint. There was that. There was a question. There was a dispute over the cover. Who would have the right to find the cover artist and approve the cover? Sal and I fought about everything. My salary was $100 a month, which hardly made the job anything that I felt I needed. And eventually we got into an irreparable dispute about a particular cover, which I wanted to use. He did not, and he fired me and hired Ted White, to my enormous relief.
What was it about this cover that caused you?
I had commissioned a friend, an artist, Bill Baker, to do a cover for two stories, two covers for two stories. One of them was by Fritz Leiber, a fantasy. The other was a David R. Bunch story, Coming Down for D-Day or such was the title, I think. The first cover for the Leiber was not very good, but Saul grudgingly approved it. The second cover for the David R. Bunch was admittedly, and I knew at the time, quite bad. And Saul said, I don't know anything about writing or science fiction, but I've been in publishing for 50 years, and I know from art, and I can't run this cover. And I said, this man, the artist, Bill Baker, is a friend, and I've commissioned him, and we have to run this cover. I'll be embarrassed otherwise. And Saul said, I won't run it, and he fired me. And that's it. He had arranged for Ted White to succeed me. White did, and lasted 10 years. Did an excellent job. Excellent. From the beginning, I wrote him, made public statements which were printed in the letter column. But I thought he was doing extraordinarily well, and I everything that I had wanted to do, he did for the same miserable pay. He was arguably the best science fiction editor, magazine editor for the 10 years of his tenure, and that's it. And then he got the magazine. Saul retired. His partner, Arthur Bernhardt in Arizona, bought it out, bought the magazine, fired Ted, and transferred the magazine to Arizona, found a local person to edit it, and the odyssey continued. I had nothing to do with the magazine editorially from the day I was fired. I continued to sell. I sold Ted White many, many stories. Some of them among my best, some of them distinctly not among my best. But I might have been amazing, not by length, because many of them were short stories, but by sheer number of contributions, I might have been Amazing's most prolific writer.
So what was the date of your departure from Amazing?
October 1st, 68.
Okay. And then what did you do after that?
I continued to write. I continued to write fee reports at the Scott Meredith Agency. I continued to attempt to sell novels. I was enormously relieved, and the onus of Amazing was removed from me, and I just went on. I went on with my so-called career. I was portrayed more or less as a hero for having been fired for defying Saul, which was and was not true. I was no hero. It was time to get out, and I was glad to do so. But I got out in a way which did not decrease whatever tiny recognition I had, and I went on with my career. I really began to sell in late '68. And the so-called early arc of my career, my most prolific years, and perhaps my best work came in the period 68 through 75. I never looked back. except in submitting stories to Amazing. I look back, and Ted Ted rejected one submission in the 10 years he was there. He took everything else. And I was neither proud of appearing in Amazing nor embarrassed. I was getting all of those stories had been rejected from higher paying markets, and I was glad to just get them in print.
Were you submitting stories to Analog at this point?
I was submitting stories all through the range of the market, and I was quite successful in that period. I had sold by 1975, at a rough guess, about 120, 130 magazine stories. Some of them quite good, some of them not so good, but I was fantasy and science fiction's most prolific contributor for some years in that period.
So I want to kind of edge into the story of your encounter with John W. Campbell, the editor of Analog. Before I get there, I wanted to ask a couple things. So this is like 1968, first half of 69. What kind of magazine was Analog at that point? How would you describe the stories that Campbell was publishing?
Campbell was, the arguments were great. Campbell was publishing Campbell. The magazine's deterioration and some marginalization was more or less credo. That was the common wisdom from the early 60s or even the late 50s on. That Campbell, for many reasons, had lost his centrality. But the magazine was always respected. It was the best-paying market, certainly from the standpoint of the art director. It was the best-looking magazine. Its circulation was twice that of its nearest competitor, Galaxy and Worlds of If. And the feeling was more the deterioration of the magazine was a source of grief, regret, anger, and grief and regret more than anger. How sad that this had happened. Withal, there was some very good work published in that magazine all through the decade. On the other hand, and this is in Engines of the Night, for my amusement in the very early 70s, I made a list of the major new science fiction writers. By new, I mean those who had come into print in 1960. I made a list of those major writers emerging in the 60s who had not ever published in Analog. And it's a fascinating list, and really all you need to know to sustain the argument that the magazine was irrelevant. Everyone from Joanna Russ to Sam Delaney to Ursula K. Le Guin to Robert Silverberg to Harlan Ellison to Tom Dish were not in the magazine. Most were never in the magazine. Some, Ben Bova went out of his way when he became editor in January of 72. Bova made a very public effort to get into the magazine the major writers and the innovative work which had been excluded in the 60s. Add Gene Wolfe and Fred Pohl to that list of writers who had never appeared in the 60s. It's a shocking list if you study it. Ballard, Aldous, Morka, and so on.
So before we get to your actual meeting with Campbell, had you exchanged letters with him?
I had written him one or two angry letters on issues of rejection, I believe. I don't have to be told that it was wholly unprofessional, and it is certainly it's not even a high-low point in my career. But he had never quite properly responded to those letters, and I don't think ever took them personally any more than I personally took the letters that I had written. And my letters were the more in sorrow than anger variety. But no, I had never had any correspondence with him.
So when you proposed the meeting, what was the pretext?
The pretext was that I had been appointed editor of the SFWA Bulletin. And I wrote Campbell and said, I've been appointed editor of the SFWA Bulletin. And in that capacity, I'd like to interview you. That was bullshit. It gave me an excuse to see him, which I had wanted for 20 years. And he said, yeah, come up. So I came up. And we were in on June 18th, 1960. Was it 69? Yes, it was. Just a month before the moon landing. I sat in his office and we talked for an hour and a half. Now, I've written about that.
Like, was this at the Gray Bar building? The Condé Nast
it was
period?
at 420 Lexington Avenue. I don't know if Gray Bar's main entrance was on 42nd. This was an entry. It was 420 Lex. I think it was not the Gray Bar building.
So what was his office like?
What was his office like? He and Kay Tarrant shared a small office in the Street and Smith corridors. No, sorry about that. The Street and Smith sold out in 1960. The Con Nast publications. Con Nast had an enormous suite of offices in that building, 420 Lexington Avenue. And he and Tarrant shared a small enclosure on one floor.
So tell me, when you arrived, what was your impression like?
Well, it was despite it was remarkable, and it was moving and intimidating to meet him, but I had so many ideological and practical quarrels with the man that I can't say it. The primary awe shifted to exasperation within 5 minutes, and we argued for an hour and a half about everything. He showed me the cover for the upcoming issue, which was the cover story was Your Haploid Heart by James Tiptree Jr. He talked about John Dolmus that a.k.a. John Jones, a new writer, had just sold him a serial, and he thought it was quite promising. He showed me the sketch for the cover for I think it was It might have been Tunnel Through the Deeps by Harry Harrison, an upcoming serial. He showed me what was coming, and he smoked and used an inhaler and smoked some more, and was all in all, I don't know, my as I said, exasperation mingled with awe, and a certain sorrow too, because I could see that he was only 60. Let me get it. It was from 1910. He was only 59 at the time, but he was an old man, and he didn't look well. We talked about the moon landing. We talked about astronauts. We talked about science fiction and his conception of it versus mine. We talked about everything. We agreed on nothing. But I hadn't entered that office to convert him. God knows, I had entered it to engage with him, which I suppose I did. He was having none of it.
Can you talk about how your views of science fiction differed from his?
Essentially, I talked about science fiction as a literary mode, an investigation of the impact, the interaction between technology and humanity. and how that could be as dangerous, as suffocating, or devastating as good. And that in seeing technology uniformly as good, as progressive, he was missing at least half the story. I pointed out that historically, the so-called Golden Age, that his magazine had been really occupied by a number of famous and very good stories which went to exactly that theme. And that in looking upon and being mechanically technophiliac as he was ignoring his own history, to say nothing of the history of science fiction as depicted by H.G. Wells before there was even a category. His response was that so-called mainstream literature in the main was about loss and losers. Science fiction was about heroes and conquest. And that is what literature should be and the effect it should have upon the reader. What could I say? I remember saying, well, take a look at Vintage Season by the Kuttners in the September 46 Astounding. Is that a story about the triumph of technological triumph of humanity and the good? Oh, he said it. That was a dilly, that story. So I said, I feel so too, but don't you think that the implied vision of that story is directly contradictory to what you are arguing here? He was having none of it. He was having none of it, but I had the sense, and this may be sentiment in retrospect, that I amused him more than I angered him. He was getting an argument which he liked, as everybody has noted about Campbell. He loved to argue, and at least according to some people like Lester Del Rey, he would take a perverse position simply for the pleasure of arguing it and defeating the other side to show his proficiency.
Can you tell me a bit about what you discussed about the moon landing?
He said that it was a great event. You see, we did agree on something, that it was a shocking, inspiring event. I remember Campbell saying to me, this is completely good. This is an absolutely good thing. This is the only government action in a lifetime, really, he said. Now, I'm quoting him, I don't agree, but he said, in which the man on the street, common humanity, could see something that his money had bought, some actual result of government spending, of his sacrifice, and this was the most tangible evidence of the way in which tax money could be used to serve human aspiration. He thought it was a great thing. So did I.
Did Campbell connect the moon landing with science fiction?
Well, certainly he connected it with science fiction. This is toward which the field and he had aspired through all of his professional and personal lifetime. He saw it as an unallayed good. He saw it as science fiction, and somewhere he had written, this might have been in the late 50s, early 60s, in a throwaway comment, first sales of Astounding on the Moon by the year 2000, I'm saying, exclamation point. Not quite, John, but I thought the moon landing was a terrific accomplishment. I also felt, as we've discussed off air, so to speak, that I knew that NASA and the program and all of that was doomed, and I knew why, and I knew it well before it happened.
Well, could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Because it was a government project, essentially to divert public attention from Vietnam and the innumerable disasters of the 60s, and to give an ad aspera aspect to humanity which at the least would be enormously diverting and could certainly be used for powerful political purposes. Beyond the moon landing, NASA had no program, whatever they told you. They had no definitive program. Everything was focused on the moon landing. And as I've written in many novels and short stories, the way in which space was approached, which was as a Rockwell painting, as a Saturday Evening Post cover of the 60s, with handsome astronauts and devoted wives and loving children and wonderful rocket ships and the affirmation of the American ideal and so on. And of course, no sex pleas were American. All making space, as it were, aseptic, was to cut all of the true complexity in life and ad aspera out of it. Ballard saw that clearly in Britain. I saw that clearly here. I've maintained for years that we were the only two science fiction writers who knew that NASA was doomed, that the program was doomed, that Apollo was doomed, and we knew why. Ballard who was a great writer and for whom I have only the greatest respect. Ballard was British. And as I wrote lightly somewhere, and therefore it doesn't count, I was a New Yorker. I was the only USA science fiction writer who really saw this and why. I've contended that all these years. If anybody has an argument, a satisfying argument to the contrary, I'd like to know. I'd like to know what other writer saw clearly before the program's enactment and then shriveling exactly what would happen and why.
Well, so as we're talking now, tomorrow is 50 years since the Apollo 11 landing.
Yes,
do you think the cultural view of the Apollo program has changed?
The cultural view has shifted largely toward irrelevance. The public view is that of irrelevance. It's a news cycle. We landed on the moon. Or 50 years ago we landed on the moon. Or someday we'll go to Mars. Means nothing. It's merely a diversion. Just as, and I've said this already, it was my deep conviction that the government, and particularly as the Apollo program accelerated in the mid-60s, was to divert attention from the horror of Vietnam and the cultural division created. It depicted government, or was an attempt to depict government as positive, whereas, of course, Vietnam had poisoned the atmosphere, and at least half the population, I think, by the late 60s, saw government as the enemy. Argue with me, surely. That was my opinion.
I kind of left you in the room with Campbell. And I was wondering if you could, I know you've told this story before, but if you could talk about how that meeting ended.
I've told the story many times before. We argued for an hour and a half. Maybe we should have gone to lunch together. It would be like having lunch, with God or Satan or some archangel somewhere. It was inconceivable that I would ask him and he never asked me. So I left. We shook hands. I left courteously. I've written this. I stood before the elevator, trembling in grief and rage that Campbell, who had been my hero just as he had been Silverberg's and Asimov's and almost everybody, every science fiction writer of the Campbell generation and thereafter, he might have been the god to be overthrown, but he was that to all of us. And I stood before, waiting for the elevator, trembling that there was just no accord. The man and I were in fundamental disagreement, and I could not get through to him. I felt that I understood. I rejected what he was saying, but I understood it. I could have made his brief. I don't think he could have made mine. He did not know what the hell I was talking about, other than to see me as a symbol or an example of that sinister new generation of SF writers who rejected him and rejected the true quill and rejected the golden age and rejected everything for which he had given his life. And the gap was unbridgeable. So I stood there waiting for the elevator, trembling with remorse and anger and despair. And he came out of his office, apparently to go to the men's room, although that God or Satan would need the men's room was almost inconceivable. And he saw me standing before the elevator trembling. And he nodded to me. He gave me a hearty slap on the back. He said, "Don't worry about it, son. I just like to shake him up." And off he went. And off I went.
So that was 50 years ago.
Yep.
When you look back at Campbell now, I mean, what do you think his legacy really is?
He was he was very flawed and absolutely indispensable. He was half a charlatan and three-quarters a genius and absolutely the center, the fundament of what we call modern science fiction. Without Campbell, nothing. Without Campbell, this, as Fred Pohl wrote on the occasion of Campbell's death, had there not been John Campbell, science fiction would have been a minor genre of its time, which would, like the Western, the nurse novel, the Gothic, have shriveled and perished. With Campbell, it became the literature of our time, of our century. And there's however you felt about the man Pohl wrote, you could not argue with that. And I never did. That's exactly right. Pohl was one of those writers excluded, as I had said. And his appearance in the March or April 72 issue of Astounding, the gold at Starbow's End, was generally agreed that was Ben Bova's symbol and signal to the world that Analog was no longer Campbell's magazine. It was the future's. It was Ben Bova's. It is inconceivable that the gold at Starbow's End would have been published by Campbell. It was published in the first issue for which Ben Bova had responsibility. It had sex, it had despair, it was dystopian, it was cynical, it was in a way anti-transcendent, it was brilliant, it was pessimistic. It almost won the Nebula and Hugo. It was greeted with an almost uniform sigh of relief from anybody to the left of Keith Laumer.
You've occasionally been described as a anti-Campbellian.
I'm not. I'm not.
You think? Yeah. So, I mean, where do you think that description comes from?
I don't know. Well, strike that. I had the fortune of the misfortune to win the first John W. Campbell Memorial Award for the best science fiction novel of the year for Beyond Apollo, published by Random House in 1972, which, in the view of those who hated that, thought was honoring in Campbell's name a novel which Campbell not only would never have published, but would have loathed. It was dystopian. It was anti-NASA. It was anti-space. It was enormously cynical about technology. It was like what? Like giving Martin Luther King International Brother Award to Donald Trump, or the Nobel Peace Prize to Henry Kissinger. That is how some people regarded it. I never felt, as I wrote somewhere in the only note of protest I ever protest against the criticism, it was my conviction that if Campbell had not frozen in 1958 or so, maybe a little earlier, 55, but had continued to evolve as an editor between 55 and 71, as he certainly had between 38 and 55, he would have published Beyond Apollo, because the novel or whether or not he would have published it. He might well have rejected it, but it wouldn't have been because it was technophobic or anti-NASA. He would have had other reasons. Maybe the sex would have bothered him. Maybe the fragmented narrative approach. But had he continued to evolve as an editor, I repeat, between 38 and 55, between 55 and 72, as he had in the 17 years preceding, it would have fallen well within his compass. He would not have rejected it for ideological reasons. I'm convinced of that. Some people defended it on that basis. Others defended it on the basis that nobody can speak for the dead, and nobody had the right to speak for the dead, and to say Campbell would have rejected this is to draw a conclusion in the absence of evidence. Who knows? It got the award a lot of publicity. I don't think it did me any particular career good. I don't know. I have nothing to say about it, really. All of it, for God's sakes, this is 50 years ago.
I know this is a very hard question to answer, but Campbell died so suddenly.
Yes.
He was 61, and he could easily have kept on editing for 10 more years, let's say. Do you think if he lived, do you think another 10 years would have changed his legacy?
I was gonna jump in here. I was gonna cut off your question because I knew exactly what your question would be, and my answer is no. No. He would have become more... Remember, this is the man who wrote an editorial published in the November 1968 issue for Maximum Relevance. He endorsed Wallace. You know that.
Oh, I know. Yes,
okay.
I know.
I think you say, have it in your magnificent book. It was not, he not only endorsed Wallace, but he devoted a good 3,000 to 4,000 words to explain why. Just like to shake him up, son. That Wallace, his contention was so different that he would force the Republic to re-examine all of its assumptions, and that was good. Heinlein Ellison wrote, there were two letters in the SFWA forum responding to that editorial. One was by Heinlein Ellison, who said, and I'm quoting exactly now, his disgusting endorsement of Wallace is a repudiation of everything for which science fiction has ever stood. And my comment in the same issue was that Campbell, after having spent 30 years showing us exactly what science fiction could be and leading us that way, was now devoting his golden years to destroying it. It was not a happy time.
I had wanted to talk a bit about Beyond Apollo and kind of where that novel came from. So do you want to talk a bit about the origins of that idea?
The origin of the idea is from a short story by Harry Harrison, published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. I believe it was 1970. The title was I Am a Robot. It is a first-person story, and I will summarize it in I hope, 50 words. It is a tape, as it were. He is addressing recording devices. I am a robot. I am the last survivor of this doomed mission. There were three of us on this mission. The two other guys and me. And at a certain point, I began to see how distressed they were, and how much danger I was in, because space was unsettling their minds as not mine. And, well, to come right to the point, they attacked me. They attacked and tried to disable me, knowing that I was aware of their madness and destructiveness, and I was forced to kill them. And this is my testimony that I did it to protect the mission, to protect myself, to protect the agency, etc. And now there is nothing to do but wait. We are on this return flight, and tell I am recording the story, which I will tell them Oh, what has happened now? Oh, I seem to have moved my hand in the wrong direction, and I have cut myself. My hand is bleeding. Bleeding? Bleeding? Blood? I see blood, all question marks. No, 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 no. I am a robot. I am a robot. Curtain. And I thought this depersonalization was very interesting, and gave me a narrative attack. I told Harry that, and I've written that. It's in print somewhere. I acknowledge the fact that reading that story more or less started the engines of the night for me. And there was a lot I had to say about NASA and the space program and its sterile nature, its asepsis, its essential craziness, as it were. It was based upon essential madness. Politically, it was a device. Its origins were more political than explorative. So I had a lot or a little on my mind, and I tried to get that into the novel, which I wrote very quickly, and which in its composition gave me no trouble.
About what, when did you start working on the novel?
The novel, I started in Random House announced a new science fiction program. They were looking for science fiction novels. I wrote a very brief opening chapter, and the portion and outline. The outline was that this short first chapter is a pretty good précis of the narrative attack and what I want to say, and the novel will go on and on in this voice toward a disastrous conclusion. And I gave it to my agent, Robert Mills, who I think to his astonishment sold it to Lee Wright, the mystery editor at Random House, who had been delegated by her publisher to create a science fiction program because, well, everybody seemed to be interested suddenly in science fiction because of Apollo and the like. And it was the first novel that she took for this program. Now, I want to jump ahead a year. The novel has been published, and we are having lunch, and Lee Wright says to me, you know, I had no experience whatsoever with science fiction. I know it interested me, but of course I was the mystery editor, and they put me in to do this because I was a genre editor. And essentially, she said, this was the first science fiction novel I had ever read in manuscript. I'd read a few, of course. And she said, oh, I think this is pretty good. And I figured it was a pretty good example of what traditional science fiction was, so I took it. And she said it was only when the novel was delivered and we began to offer this to book clubs that it occurred to me that perhaps it was not a typical science fiction novel.
Wow. So what year was the novel acquired?
The novel, I was just online this morning on my birthday, peering at Wikipedia and online reviews of this novel. I'll say this for Beyond Apollo, that it was published June of 72. It was published 47 years ago. It was written 48 years ago, and it is still getting people angry. There are the comment section here and there and the various reviews. This novel got people angry on publication. It's getting people who encounter it angry today, and the arguments are just as passionate on both sides. This I take to be a kind of success.
I agree.
It is Horowitz's World, the same thing, same story. It angered a lot of people then, and it still angers them today. How was it received? It was received. There was a whole range of responses. Overall, before the Campbell Award, it was greeted more or less complacently. Well written, not your ordinary thing. Kind of anti-NASA, kind of technophobic, but well written and a new approach and so on. The reviews were such as they were not hostile. Then I won the Campbell Award, and you know the rest of the story.
Well, can you tell me a bit about where you were professionally before the book came out? Like where were you?
I was on my way.
Career?
I had sold, at that point, I had sold 7 or 8 science fiction novels, and maybe 25 novels overall. My voice was under control. The best novel I ever wrote was already 6 months behind me. I knew what I was doing. Creatively, I was approaching a peak. Professionally, I was getting noticed, and I was selling with relative ease. So it was, in those terms, it was a good period. I was not quite a prominent writer, but I was well on the way toward becoming one. I stood maybe a little behind, in this country, I stood a little behind Ballard and Dish as a new, rather avant-garde, literary, in quotes, science fiction writer who was on his way.
And do you think that changed, or how did that change after
the Campbell
Award
was very deeply controversial for those who noticed. The essential argument against the Campbell Award, was that the first John W. Campbell Memorial Award for the best science fiction novel of the year, the first John Campbell Award. Campbell died, of course, June 11th, 71, or July 11th, one or the other. In any event, the award was announced just about a year later as a retrospective award given in his name for what a select committee would judge the best science fiction novel of the year. And that announcement was made in July of 71. The award itself was conveyed in April of 73. Now, I'm sorry, I've got the dating wrong. I apologize. It was 72. It was July. Campbell died in June of 71. The award was announced a year and a month later, and was given in April of 73 for novels published in the previous calendar year. And the source of all the noise and the controversy and the unhappiness was that this award was being given to a novel which Campbell not only would never have published in his magazine, but which he would have hated. It was full of sex. It was full of 4-letter words. The protagonist was crazy. NASA was depicted as a scam and a bureaucratic trap, and the space program itself as a monstrous diversion, purposeful diversion of public attention from Vietnam and the catastrophes of government. This was not a viewpoint with which Campbell would have agreed. It is not nor Poul Anderson, nor a lot of people. And Poul Anderson, in a letter of protest published in Analog, said, "Give an award. It's a good novel and so on. And if you want to honor it, call it the Harry Harrison Award or the H.G. Wells Award or the Great Science Fiction Award, but don't. To call it the John W. Campbell Award is to insult the memory of the editor and to taunt him, if not spit in his face." Anderson was very mad. He apologized 20 years later in a letter to Analog, but didn't make much difference. A lot of people felt that way. The novel had its defenders. There were some strong letters in the Analog brass tacks column about this on both sides, and eventually, like all controversies, and particularly literary controversies, it settled. But there was a lot of unpleasantness on both sides, and I was marked forever in the minds of the opinion of some and the history of some as a kind of science fiction antichrist, and anti-Campbell, and anti-technological, anti-space exploration, and so on. The novel had defenders like Harlan Ellison, like George Zabrowski. There were some eminent people, certainly, who took my side on one basis or the other. But it was an unhappy business. And it's one of those things nobody ever forgot. Like, nobody ever forgot that Ezra Pound was locked up in a lunatic asylum for a decade instead of being tried for treason. Whether or not that was good, that label was always on Pound. There was no way his poems were read, reviewed, discussed, considered without that biography being central to the perception. And to no small degree, albeit not as extreme, it was true of Beyond Apollo and me.
Did the reaction have any immediate effect on your career, the kind of shape it was taking?
I sold a lot of novels, particularly to Roger Elwood on the basis for first winner of the John Campbell Memorial Award. It had a very positive effect in the very short term. The very short term lasting a year or less. Later on, it was always billed. It was never forgotten in any kind of promotion, but it was not regarded as significant. Initially, the effect on my career was remarkably strong. Then, as the implications of the novel and its reception began to drift through the polity, it became more trouble than it was worth, probably. Still, it was published in June 2nd, 1972. It was published 48 years ago. It was published 47 years ago. And it's in print and it's digitally available. And there was lots of commentary online. It's most novels published in 1972 in any category are not as prominent. The same month that Random House published Beyond Apollo, they published Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and by You Know Who, and The Car Thief by Theodore Wiesner. Hunter Thompson certainly beat me out for publicity then and to this moment, but the Wiesner novel, which is a good novel by a good guy who, with all the proper credentials, Iowa Writers Workshop and so on, had moderate response and died. It is absolutely gone. Whereas Beyond Apollo, in part because of the science fiction category, has a kind of frail sublife. And it has more exposure than almost any novel published in 1972, whether positive or negative. And which is not to say it's got a hell of a lot of attention. I do not misunderstand how marginal all of this is and how many years ago this happened. But the very controversy and its implications kept this novel alive, whereas otherwise it might have been The Car Thief.
How do you feel, when you think back to that novel now about it?
I reread it for the first and only time carefully in detail about 5 or 6 years ago. I dedicated my mall walking, my dangerous reading while walking mall excursions to reading that novel from cover to cover. And I think it's fine. It's very limited. It is a stunt. It is a stunt. And it was conceived as a stunt. And it plays all the tricks that so-called postmodern lit plays with its unreliable narrator and its shaky, arguable realism, all of that. It was deliberately limited. It was almost a technical exercise. I thought it comes off very well, as long as you understand that it's an early Haydn symphony. Call it Haydn's morning, noon, and night. Call it his 6th, 7th, and 8th symphonies. which are little masterpieces but don't touch the Oxford Symphony or the London Symphonies. It was deliberately limited. It was exactly what I felt I could handle with virtuosity at the time, and I did. I'm satisfied with it, and I'm satisfied that I never have to try that again. And I did a lot of other. There was a lot of other ambitious or tricky writing, but that particular stunt I never tried again. I guess it's all right. It's really not for me to judge, is it?
Suppose not. So do you think if that novel had either not been written at all or if it had gotten like a very different kind of reception, I mean, how do you think that would have changed, the course of your career?
I think ultimately I might have had it a little easier. I would not have been such a symbol and a target. But you simply don't know. You don't know, and this is something surely at 39 you understand it. I've said for years that in the summer of 1963, I decided I wanted to take a creative writing course at the new school in the summer, and the new school offered so-called counseling advice as to who or what to take. So I spoke to some guy there at a desk, and he said, well, we're offering 2 courses this summer. One is taught by Herbert Kubley, whose friend Kay Boyle will often accompany him to teach classes. And he's a good guy, rather rigorous, rather stern, rather traditional. The other one is taught by Anatole Broyard. And Broyard is a little bit freer. And I thought, well, I'd like to be free. I'm 24 years old. I'm an aspirational free guy. So I'll go with Broyard. So I went with Broyard, and I met my wife. And I will, within half an hour, see my daughters because of a whim. So that's my answer. If would it have been any different if I hadn't written that novel, or Random House had not been looking for novels, or Lee Wright had known a little more about science fiction? Who knows? But then, and also, this is something you know well enough at 39, if you look back upon your life, there's a kind of frozen and even frightening inevitability about it. That this was there is a solidity to it. This is, and there was no other way. So somewhere combining those two truths, you tell me.
So one thing I wanted to talk about is your nonfiction.
Yeah.
Your critical writings, which I think, was it around this time that you began to, work more in that mode?
Yeah, a little, yes. I wrote a review. Ed Furman magazine of F&SF asked me to write a review, which was published in a 1972 issue. It was the first review I had ever written anywhere, let alone paid for it. And I wrote a few reviews for him, and I began to do some commentary. And I began to poke around in it rather cautiously. And in my opinion, retrospectively, not particularly successfully. I did that through the 70s. And then with Engines of the Night, as I compiled the essays for Engines of the Night, which was in the late 70s, I took it a little or a lot more seriously. And I got a lot better. I began to learn how to write the personal essay. An expedition which continues. And I guess I've done a lot of it by now.
Do you think there was a point of view or an argument that you were making at that point that was not being made by others?
No, they were making it. Joanna Russ was making it and at the time, and Damon Knight brilliantly had been making it 20 years earlier, as had Blish. Knight's simple proposition, which was anarchic in the early 50s when he began, is that science fiction is a branch of literature just like everything else is a branch of literature, and it must observe and conform to the same rigorous literary demands, as any other kind of literature. It doesn't get a pass because kids love it, or it's visionary, or it deals with the future, or the material is special. The same demands that are made in the writing of literary fiction, good literary fiction, apply to science fiction. This was very controversial at the time, and Knight made friends and he made enemies, but he was terrifically influential. And I never differed with him, and essentially Budgers came along, and in a decade later, completely overtaken by that proposal, by that position, and continued to express it. And Tom Dish, Joanna Russ, John Clute, Moorcock, and Ballard, and it became the prevailing standard of science fiction criticism, or at least good science fiction criticism, which continues to this time. There was nothing innovative about my approach. I simply wanted science fiction to be good the way that Lolita was good, and Evan Cannell's Diary of a Rapist was good, and on and on, and The Long Goodbye, and any other, and Babbitt, and Arrowsmith, and for that matter, the Caine Mutiny, or Marjorie Morningstar, and or The Naked and the Dead, and I could rattle it on. They were good, and science fiction should be good. And it did not have to observe, obviously, the same conceptual approach, but structural approach, rhetorical approach. Yes, definitely. To me, it seemed indisputable. And Knight won his case, and he has prevailed absolutely, except that science fiction itself, as we know, science fiction has been overtaken by fantasy, and both have been overtaken by a relaxation, if not a destruction, of critical standard. And I don't know whether you agree with that or not, but that's my position. And some hold that.
Well, if that's true, I mean, if that's your argument, was there a point at which you started to see that happening?
Oh, sure. I've been seeing that happening since Star Wars. It was evident with Star Trek a little, but Star Trek actually had a benign influence on the field, because Star Trek misled publishers into believing that the science fiction audience was much larger, or potentially larger, and ambitious than it turned out to be. Star Trek extended the audience and marked that point at which publishers began to pay real attention and began to pay serious money for some science fiction. And there was a tiny little renaissance, a second golden age between, say, 69 and 76, and then came Star Wars. And Star Wars finished it off. Not commercially, as we know. It made it big business, and essentially the modest literafication, if I may, of science fiction between 68 or so and 76 was undone by Star Wars, and the general perception that Star Wars was the default mode of science fiction, and this was the way to go. You throw in Tolkien there. You throw in Tolkien and the derivative modern fantasy, and that's been the story for the last 50 years.
I mean, when you look around at science fiction as it's evolved, let's say over the past like 20 years or so, I mean, what do you see? How does it make you feel?
I see as little as I can, which is the immediate, in quotes, witty response. I don't like what is going on, but I can ascribe that, as I have in the essay collection bend at the end of the road. I'm willing to ascribe that as much to age and its effects as to the objective state of the field. But I am not particularly interested in or hopeful about the science fiction of today. Others may carry it on. To the degree that I follow it, I think it is infused with decadence and repetition. There are major talents in the field. Don't misunderstand me. There are terrific writers, but terrific writers can write for the market just as well as not so terrific writers, and work has been shaped for the market, as it should be if you're trying to survive as a writer.
Well, if you were speaking to like a version of yourself, let's say in your late 20s, who was starting out now in science fiction, would you have any advice?
Not a chance. Not doing what I was doing. Now, I had boundless energy and a kind of ravaged sense of ambition. I might have been able to conform to it. I don't know. I might in my late 20s have been able to go that way. I couldn't today. I'm doubtful if I could have done it in my late 20s, but I would have tried to advance myself in the market. I don't think I would have succeeded. I would have been willing. Today, if I were to invent a pseudonym and attempt to replicate a career, no way. If I were to go in there under my own identity, absolutely not. Nothing would be possible.
Do you have any thoughts, sort of about how your career went and how it might have surprised you? Like how it was different from what you expected maybe going in?
Well, I have a lot of scattered thoughts on that, many of which I've shared with you. The degree of success I had between 68 and 76 astonished me. I went so far beyond my modest ambitions at the earliest point that I was stunned. I didn't think I'd do that well. It just in terms of racking up sales and being able to support myself as a writer and finding an audience for what I was doing, and miraculously I was able to do what I wanted within science fiction. Writing science fiction in no way did I feel compromised, that I feel I had to write below my best ability or below my true opinions to succeed during that period. So I was astonished. And otherwise, as I have been saying, and I know I've said it to you, if I look at the whole thing in the aggregate, I am grateful. I was able to get the work for which I was put on earth to do done. It was not commercially successful. There was a lot of grief. In many ways, I can regard my so-called career as an affliction, but I got everything that I wanted to do. I got it done, and I got it done as well as I possibly could, and I got it in print. So that's good enough. I mean, that's in sum, it's good enough. How to deal with late career and with old age, with the situation now, is an entirely separate problem.
On a more personal level, were there particular like friendships or partnerships that stand out in your mind as being especially rewarding?
Well, Pronzini and I, as you know, collaborated on 5 novels. At least 4 of them were of the commercial intent, and they did pretty well, and they're good novels. We threw in 70 or 80 short stories and a very close continuing friendship along the way, and that was good. I've collaborated with a lot of people. Pronzini was the most important collaboration, I suppose. Kathleen Koja and I wrote only short stories, about 25 of them, but they contain my best work, in my opinion. She got the best out of me. I got the best out of her. we did some remarkable work. There were lots of other collaborations I did. There's one story with Carter Scholl's, The High Purpose, which is as good as anything I ever did, I think, and so on. I collaborated a lot. Of my 450, that's an approximation, published short stories, I'd say that maybe 140, 150 are collaborative. Some are quite good. Some aren't so good. Jack Dan and I also did some good work.
I know it's hard to generalize about so many stories, but what does it really mean to collaborate on a short story?
Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody has. What does it mean? You get it done. And every collaboration has different methods. And Pronzini and I had different methods within our collaboration. I would start a story and he would finish it. He would start a story and finish it. We would be under the same roof and we would alternate paragraphs. He would come to me with an idea. I would come to him with an idea. We would do drafts. Maybe we wouldn't do drafts. Whatever worked for the story, whatever worked for us. Koja and I, it was a long-distance collaboration. It was miraculous. I felt we did, essentially, we alternated sections. And I felt my sections were as written by her, hers as by me. I saw no difference. I understood so absolutely her style, her intent, her very syntactical tricks. I knew it all. Didn't have to have a thing explained to me. She could do the same thing. It was as if the stories were written as I was writing them. Everything is different. Some of the collaborations were effortful. I did a few stories with Mike Resnick. That was less inspiration than carpentry. Everything, like marriage, you know, whatever works for you, whatever works for the people involved, is optimum.
And are you working on anything right now?
Well, I did an introduction to a reissue of an old novel just the night before last. I'm doing personal essays. I've lost, for many reasons, I've lost patience with fiction, and I'm beginning to question its very relevance, at least for me. I'm not as interested as I should be. I'm writing personal essays. I'm writing well. What I'm doing, I'm not disappointed with what I'm able to get out. I haven't unraveled yet. But obviously, I am not doing a fraction of what I was doing 20 years ago. I guess I should stick this in somewhere in the interview for the record. Beyond Apollo is a novel I've always felt which had a very special, I don't know if the word is curse, and it had a special karma on it. You want the story of this novel? The story you won't read, and it certainly doesn't appear in any editions. You want it? You think it's relevant?
Yeah.
All right. I wrote this novel was dedicated to my late uncle, Herbert Finney, who occupies he has two cameos in the novel. He's the visitation of the narrator's late uncle, who appears in the spaceship and gives him some worthless advice. I dedicated, and it was Herbert's voice, to the chairman of the real estate of New York, chairman of the real estate board of New York, president of a real estate company, graduate of the Naval Academy in 1920, kind of a Heinlein type, very much so, ideologically and in his personal conduct. He has a cameo role in the novel. I delivered it on his birthday. It was delivered on August 27th, 1971. Bennett Cerf died, the Random House publisher, founder and publisher, died the next day. The editor, the acquiring editor, Lee Wright, who was an alcoholic, had a complete breakdown and was put away in a sanitarium a month later to dry out for 2 months. All of this before publication. The cover was for the original Random House edition was done by a very promising young artist, and then 32 or 33, Roger Hayne, Hane. remarkable cover. Roger Hayne, before the book was published, I believe, in the year before it was published, his wife gave him a present of a new bicycle, and he took it out to Central Park to try it out. A group of 8 or 9 youths decided they admired the bicycle, and they wanted it. They took it from him. He resisted. They killed him. They beat him to death. And it was headline news in the tabloids for a couple of days, and that was the end of it. He was beaten to death. The wife remained in the apartment. She stayed there. She remarried. She found someone. She remarried. He moved into the apartment circa 1975 or 76. In 82, he killed her in the apartment and was jailed and tried and jailed and convicted and so on. That's the Beyond Apollo story. To say nothing of the contempts about the Campbell Award, all of the bad karma and unhappiness and nastiness surrounding it. So, I don't know how much of a mystic you are, but it's an interesting story.